Good morning and welcome to our Sunday school class where we've been going over different themes and images of the Bible. One of the things that's important for us to understand as we study the Bible is that the Bible was written in a culture that's much different than ours, and it's a culture that is very much geared toward the things that are phenomenological. That means that it gears things toward the way that things appear and the meaning of those appearances. So, as an example, we look at a tree and we think, maybe what is it made out of? What could we do with it? What could we make out of it? Scientifically, how do we understand the tree? But that's not how the ancient world looked at things like trees. Now, they did think about, things that they can make with it, but more often than not, it was about what do things like trees mean? What's the meaning behind these things? They lived in a world that was very much wedded to meaning in all kinds of things. So even things like clay pots or dust and dirt, all these things had meaning for ancient people. And we don't really think of things like that anymore. And so when we study the Bible, it's important for us to understand the ancient mindset so that we can look at it and make sense of it. So one of the things that we've been talking about over the last couple weeks is we've been talking about these themes and images as they go through the Bible. And the last week we studied the idea of mountains and what do mountains mean. It's a very significant and interesting fact that almost all the major things that happen in the Bible happen in either on or in the vicinity of mountains, and mountains are almost always involved in things. So we talked about the fact that Eden was on a mountain. We talked about the fact that Sinai and the covenant that was given there is on a mountain, and we talked about many things about Jesus' ministry were on mountains. And then finally in the book of Revelation, the new heavens and earth, the new Jerusalem, is the new Zion, it's new mountain. So when we talked about this issue of mountains, we talked about the fact that a mountain was a place where you can get as close to the heavenlies as possible. So in the ancient understanding of what it is, what exists, in the ancient understanding of reality, there was basically three different aspects, and it could be represented roughly by the sky, and then the land, and then the sea. And really what this represents is that the sky is the heavenlies. It's the place where things are, they don't have a physical form. And so theories can be very perfect. Theories can account for everything. Then you have the land where it's not quite as perfect as all of that. And then you have the ocean, which is full of chaos and possibilities. The land's kind of an in-between. And so you can kind of think of it as in the heavenlies, you can have your perfect theories that account for everything. And then you have, on the other hand, far from that, you have chaos where you don't really know what to make of anything. And then in the middle, you have the land where your theories work, but they only go so far. And you understand how to make things work, but you're limited in your understanding. You don't have complete knowledge and perfection as you do in the heavenlies. A mountain is a place where you're on the land, but you've gotten to the highest point that you can in the air. And so it's the place where you encounter God. The place where you encounter God is not at the beach. We as a culture, we're kind of obsessed with beaches. Everybody wants to go to a beach, go to Hawaii, go to Tahiti. Everybody loves the beach. But in the ancient world, that's not really the way that they viewed things. What you really want to do is you want to get on the mountain, because then you're still on the land and you can't really help that, but you're as close to the heavenlies as you possibly can be. That's the area you want to be in your life. And so you can kind of think about it as in the idea that you have as much order and knowledge and wisdom and discernment. You have as much your life organized to the point where it's as good as it can possibly be. And now you can't get perfection in that. And in fact, striving for perfection is a dangerous game because the earth is not the place for perfect order. There's an element of you'll never be able to account for everything. You'll never be able to perfect everything. You'll never be able to make everything exactly the way that it is in the heavenlies on earth. And if you try, that's the way of madness and destruction. Now, in understanding this, it's important to see that mountains are the place of highest order, and then everything underneath the mountain is a hierarchy. So what the gods do in the ancient world, and what God does historically in the Jewish religion and also in Christianity, what God does is he creates order. You see this in the creation of the world in Genesis. Remember that God, basically he takes the world and he separates things. He separates light from darkness, then brings it together and calls the two, light and dark, that 24-hour period, that's a day. And then he takes water and land and he separates them, and he takes air and separates that, and he separates man and woman and brings them together in a marriage. So what God is doing in this separation and bringing together is that he's creating order, and that order is reflective in the fact that the world becomes a place of fruitfulness. So by doing that, God acts as a judge, and that's a part of who God is that we are very kind of uncertain about. Now a lot of our culture is very hostile to the idea of God as judge, but even as Christians, we can be kind of wary of that or uncertain of that. We don't really like to talk about that. That's a very strange thing from the ancient mindset. In the ancient world, the fact that God is judge is a fantastic thing. In fact, it's one of the greatest attributes of who God is, and one of the most useful attributes of who God is, because you need something that judges. You need something that makes sense out of everything. And if God doesn't judge, then anybody's idea of what's right or wrong, good or bad, valuable, not valuable, is as good as anybody else's. You can't really complain about Genghis Khan and the way that he just destroyed people and villages and towns and that kind of thing. You can't really complain about that if there's no God to make sense out of that. You can say you don't like it, but that's a different thing than saying that it's wrong or that it's not valuable. So what God does by being judge is that God makes sense out of the world, and God makes sense out of our lives. And so ancient people welcomed that, but there's a downside that comes with that, and that downside is that because God is a judge and we need him to be a judge, we welcome God's judgment, but then we find ourselves not able to stand under God's judgment because we mess things up. And so God's judgment is this problem that needs a resolution. It's a problem because we can't live without a God who is a judge, but we can't live with a God who is a judge because we can't survive it. So this is the situation that exists in the ancient world, is that there's a problem here, and that it's great that God judges because we can make sense out of life, but it's terrible that God judges because we find ourselves on the wrong side of that judgment. Now, in order to deal with that situation, what you find is that in the Bible, there's all kinds of instances where people build altars. And in fact, the relationship with God and being in a covenant with God kind of means seeking out altars and doing offerings, sacrifices at them, and often building altars. And what we want to do is understand, well, what is an altar? Because it's related to a mountain. In fact, almost all the time, if it's possible, you find altars being built on mountains. There's times when it's not possible. There's times when something happens that's not on a mountain that requires an altar being built to commemorate it. But often you find mountains being the place where altars are built. And in fact, throughout the kingdom era of Israel, both the United Kingdom and the divided kingdom, one of the things that you find being said over and over again was about breaking down the high places. Well, what would happen is you would go up on a mountain and people would build altars to different foreign gods, different idols. And the kings either had to deal with that or refused to deal with that. And a king that was good would go up in those high places and he would break those high places down. So the situation is that altars and mountains are very much connected, and they're connected in more than one way. It's not just the fact that you find altars on mountains. It's the fact that an altar is a mountain. It's a mountain that you build. And so if you were constructing an altar back in the ancient times, you would either pile up bricks that you would make, or you'd pile up dirt, or you'd pile up stones, what's available to you, and that would be your altar. And we want to understand why this is, and we want to understand what altars are and how they relate to mountains, because it's important for us, if we're going to understand the Old Testament and how it plays into the New Testament, we need to understand exactly what's happening here with altars and how they relate to mountains. So the first thing that we're going to do is look at Genesis chapter 8, verse 20. And this is, we get, introduced to an altar here, and this is not the first sacrifice. Remember, Cain and Abel, they had a sacrifice, but this is the time where we're introduced to building an altar. And it says in chapter 8, verse 20, then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean and, then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So Noah, he builds this altar after he goes through the chaos of the flood. And this is actually not accidental. It really isn't. So if we turn in our Bibles back to Genesis chapter 3, one of the things that we would see, Genesis chapter 4, one of the things that we would see here is, let's turn here. So in Cain and Abel, we have Genesis chapter 4. It's starting in verse 3. It says, in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, why are you angry, and why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desires for you, but you must rule over it. So we have this situation where we have an offering being mentioned, but there's no mention of an altar. And yet in Genesis chapter 8, we have Noah here. He's building an altar, and he's taking some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird, and he's offering burnt offerings on the altar. Now, the interesting thing for us is, well, why are altars mentioned now? We could have just been told that Noah made an offering, but we're told that Noah made an altar. Now, remember what's just happened. Noah has built an ark, and he's gotten through the flood. There's the flood of chaos that's happened, and we're on just the other side of that flood of chaos, and we have this altar being built. And the altar, again, is a symbolic mountain. And remember what we talked about, that you have the heavens where things are ordered and good and right. You have the waters that are full of chaos and full of possibilities, but also full of death. And if you've just gotten through that, what do you build? If you've just gotten through chaos, if you've just survived chaos, what do you do? Think about it this way. Let's say that you've gotten involved in a relationship that was very chaotic and very toxic. You never knew where you stood, and you never understood what was going on. It was very toxic. What do you get out of that relationship? What do you do? What's the first thing you're going to do? Are you going to maybe try to figure out, how do I avoid this next time? Are you going to maybe do some studying, maybe figure out, how do I order myself? How do I find good relationships? How do I order my world and order my relationships such that I don't end up back here again? Well, of course, that's what you're going to do. you go out of chaos and you try to climb up into order. You try to get away from that. You've survived that. You don't want to go there again. So you build an altar. And so Noah builds an altar. Remember, altar is a symbolic mountain, and it's a place where God and man are going to meet. It's a place where not only God and man are going to meet, but there's going to be a union between God and man. So the union of God and man happens on a mountain, but you can even zoom in farther and say that on the mountain, the union of God and man happens on the altar. Okay, so it's like a mountain on a mountain. And that's the place where the union of God and man are going to meet. The union of order that God represents, and that order that leads to fruitfulness and life and blessing, versus the chaos that is down below. This order, that place where you find that, is on the altar. So Noah builds an altar to the Lord, and he takes some of every clean animal and every unclean bird and offers burnt offerings. Now, the interesting thing is Noah's going to offer these clean birds, and these are or clean birds and animals. These are going to become the basis for the sacrificial system that goes all the way into the Israelite times. But also, one of the things that's going to happen here is that Noah is going to he's going to be given. In fact, humanity is going to be given a couple of things. Number one, he's going to be given the ability to eat meat, which hasn't, or the authority to eat meat, which hasn't happened earlier. And he's going to be given the authority to put to death animals and people that have taken human life. And so those things are going to go together. So Noah's going to have the ability to eat meat, and eating meat is going to be very important to the idea of covenant. In fact, food and the table, a table is basically an altar. So whenever you sit down to eat a meal, you're sitting down to an altar. You don't see it that way. We as Americans and modern people, we don't see it that way at all. But from an ancient understanding, every time you sit down to eat a meal, you're sitting down at an altar. And what you're doing is you're enacting something that's very symbolic, theologically speaking. So we just talked in our Thursday night class about Jesus in this issue that he had with the religious leaders about washing the hands before you eat. This is where some of that comes from, is because the idea of eating, you're sitting at an altar and you're doing something theologically significant. That's why they had issues with that. So let's continue on. Exodus chapter 20. Now, remember what's happening in Exodus chapter 20 is that the Israelites have been freed from captivity and bondage in Egypt, and they've gone to the wilderness, and they're at Mount Sinai. And at Mount Sinai, remember that God gives the covenant to them. He gives the Ten Commandments and some other things, some other laws and things that they have to obey. And when we get to Exodus chapter 20, verse 24, this is after the Ten Commandments, and what's happening now is that God's giving them some other commandments, some other things, some other laws that they have to deal with. These are more ceremonial and administrative and things like that. So what's happening here in verse 24 of Exodus chapter 20 is it says, "An altar of earth you shall make for me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you profane it." So it's kind of interesting. What's happening here is that God is starting to restrict the idea of worship of him. And so previously to this, if you were an Israelite, you were the head of your household, the patriarch of your family, you were the priest of your family, and so if your family was going to worship God and do offerings, then you did it in the way that you thought was best and I'm sure that there were cultural and historical kind of boundaries around that. And one of the reasons that we see that that's probably the way that it was is because when we look at Noah, he there's an understanding of what a clean animal and an unclean animal is, even in Noah's time. So there's some boundaries around that, but to a large extent, you are the priest of your family. There's really nobody higher than that, and so you kind of decide how you're going to do that and what you're going to do. Now, what God is doing is He's starting to restrict that, and when the altar at the tabernacle is finished, when the tabernacle has been dedicated, once that happens, then the idea is that you can't, as the patriarch of your family, you can't make an offering on an altar yourself at all. You have to go to the tabernacle to have that done. Now, there's a really important point to this. Why is God starting to restrict this? Why is He starting to make it so where people can't do their own thing? They have to do. They have to go to the. First of all, they have to build an altar a certain way now, and then later on, they're going to have to go to the tabernacle. Why is God doing that? Well, first of all, let's look at verse 25 of the passage we just read. It says, "If you make an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones. If you wield your tool on it, you profane it." The idea here is that you stack up the stones, but you don't carve the stones. The idea here is that the altar is made out of the things that God has made. Now, do you have a hand in that? Yes, but that there's an extreme limit to that, and we'll understand why here in a little bit. But you have to understand that the things that the altar is made out of are the things that God has made, not the things that you have made. You have a hand in how God is worshiped, and you have a role in worshiping God, but there's a lot of things about this that you don't create that God does Himself, and you have to recognize those boundaries. And if you trespass those boundaries, then you profane the name of God, and you turn this into a worship of yourself, and a worship that you've created instead of one that God has created. So you have to be careful about that. Now, the other question is, well, why is God starting to restrict this? And that's important. The reason that God is restricting this is because worship at the altar is all about covenantal unity. It's an acting out of covenantal unity. And that happens at the mountain that's on the mountain. That's covenantal unity happens at the mountain on the mountain. So what does that mean? Well, it means this. Think about it this way. How do you have God and you have you, and the question is that, if you watch Oprah Winfrey or any of those kinds of things, you talk to people who are spiritual people, people always they say they want to get closer to God. And the question is, well, how do you do that? How do you get closer to God? The answer to that is actually found in this issue of building altars and making sacrifices on them. The idea behind this is that what's taking place is that God is consuming the sacrifice. God, the way that you get closer to God, the way that you experience unity with God, is that God consumes you. He eats you. Okay, now that sounds weird to us, but that's why tables that's why tables are also altars. So let me show you how this works. We can go to let's see. Let's go to Ezekiel chapter 41, verse 22. In Ezekiel here, we have these plans for this kind of spiritual temple, spiritual place of worship for God. And in verse 22, it says, an altar of wood, 3 cubits high, 2 cubits long, and 2 cubits broad. Its corners, its base, and its walls were of wood. He said to me, this is the table that is before the Lord. So an altar is a table. Now, the interesting thing is, in the tabernacle and the temple, you actually had 3 different altars. You had one altar in the courtyard area. You had 2 altars in the holy place. So there was the brazen altar that was in the courtyard area. Then there was the laver, and then you went into the Holy of Holies. And in the Holy of Holies, you had the altar of incense. But you also had the table of showbread. That table is also an altar. A table and an altar, that's one and the same. The reason for that is because an altar is a place where God consumes his meal. And so what you had happening in the Old Testament when worship was being done in the tabernacle or the temple, you had a situation where people would come, they would bring an animal, that animal was slaughtered, and an altar is actually, the word for altar is place of slaughter. You slaughter that animal, the blood gets splashed on the altar, and then the meat would be put on the altar and burned. And in that burning, the smoke would rise up, and the idea is the smoke is rising up to heaven because the idea was that God is eating that sacrifice. And what he's eating is he's eating you, because when you made a sacrifice, you put your hand on the animal, you put your hand on that animal, and the idea was that you and the animal became you. The animal started to represent you. And so it was killed, and that death took away its sins. It's important to understand that there's 2 things that happen, and these 2 things are different things. The killing and the display of blood, that's the penalty for sin. That's how sin gets dealt with. But then after that, the animal gets put on the altar and it gets burned, and then God is eating it. It's going up to where God is. And that's how you get close to God, is that there's a unity there, and eating is a symbol of that unity. And that's why there was always, when people made covenants in the Old Testament, there was a covenant meal. That's why we have communion as a covenant meal, because a covenant is a transformation. A covenant is a time where 2 separate things become one thing. There's a unity that's created, and that's represented through our eating of food. When you eat food, that thing that was outside of you and separate from you, it becomes part of you. And so an altar is a place where this happens, and a table is a place where this happens. So the table and the altar are pictures of one another. Now, the important thing is that why is it that God restricts people from just going in their backyard and having the patriarch do the altar? Why does God restrict that? He says, no, you have to go to the tabernacle now, or the temple. The reason is because there is a unity, that Israel is becoming a nation. Before this, Israel was a tribe. It was a grouping of families. And so family heads had their individual relationships with God. Now there's going to be a unity among the people, and the people of Israel are going to have a relationship with God. And so the people of Israel need to go to one altar and worship God, because there's one place, there's one way that God is going to have a unity with that people, and that one place, that one way is the only way that you can do it. So when we talk in Christianity about that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, Jesus is the one way to God, this isn't a new concept. This comes from this restriction of the Old Testament, where if you as a people, you don't have an individual relationship with God in the way that you think you do, probably. Now, I'm not saying that there's no individual relationship with God. I'm saying that there's an individual aspect and a corporate aspect, and we often misunderstand the nature of the corporate aspect. Jesus is united to his body. He's not united to a bunch of individual things or people. He's united to his body, one body. He has one body. And so there is one union between God and his body. There's not millions of separate unions. There's one union. And so as you have a relationship with God, you have a unit, you're part of the body of Christ. And so that's why we're called to not stop meeting together. That's why we're called to love one another and to be in congregations and be doing things with one another, because we have our relationship with Christ is part and parcel of our relationship with each other. There's a connection there that can't be undone or broken. It'd be like this, my brain has a relationship with my entire body. It doesn't have a separate relationship with each distinct part, because those parts, not only do they relate to the head, but they relate to each other. My hand relates to my arm as well as to my brain, and my arm relates to my shoulder and my trunk, my chest, as well as to my brain. And then there was a connection. There is one spinal column that goes down and connects to all those parts. And so the issue here is that we can't give up being the body of Christ. We can't just say, oh, I'm going to go off and have my own separate relationship with God and not be part of a church or part of anything that's going on. And the interesting thing is I run into a lot of things on the internet with people who, well, I'm not going to go to a church because none of the churches are good anymore, and all of the churches are bad, and they're all corrupt now, and they're all this and that. And basically what they're saying is that, number one, is there's no church that's good enough for me. I'm better than all of that. Somehow the sins that the church has, is, I don't have sins. But secondly, if you look at the New Testament, well, those churches were full of problems too. And the way to deal with that is you can't say I'm going to have a separate relationship with God apart from his body. We're called to minister to one another and to make the body whole and complete and pure. And you have to go into the churches and help solve the problems that are there. You have to go into the churches and help deal with the sin, and you have to go into the churches and help deal with the corruption. That's what we're called to do. There's no opting out of that. There's no well, I'm just going to do my own thing. That's not the way that it works. God has a people. Jesus has a church. His body is the church. If you can't deal with the church, then you can't deal with Jesus. Because he deals with his body. That's the way that it works. So what we have here is an interesting thing, and we can go down even to Exodus chapter 24, verse 4. So a few chapters later, again, they're still dealing with all the laws and the administrative tasks and everything of the church, but they're also doing some covenantal covenantal unity tasks, you could say. There's some ceremonies. And so in Exodus chapter 24, verse 4, it says, "And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrifice peace offerings of the oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half the blood and put it in the basins, and half the blood he threw against the altar." And so what Moses is going to do is he's going to take these basins and he's going to throw those basins against these 12 pillars that represent the 12 tribes. And the idea is that this blood there's a unity now. All the people are united to this altar. They're all united to this covenant, and the blood has been the thing that does that. So as we look at this, the question kind of arises is if altar is a place of slaughter, that doesn't sound very good. And if you go to the altar and you have to make a sacrifice, well, sacrifice doesn't sound all that great. You have to pay for an animal and it gets killed. This seems like kind of a downer kind of way to worship God, but we shouldn't think of it really that way. one of the things that we should understand is that when you go to the altar, you're going back to God. And so even though it requires sacrifice, it's not a bad thing. So Ezekiel chapter 43, verse 17, it says, the ledge also shall be square. Again, in Ezekiel, we're getting this picture of this kind of spiritual or heavenly temple, and it's describing the altar once again. The ledge also shall be square, 14 cubits long by 14 broad, with a rim around it, half a cubit broad, and its base 1 cubit all around. The steps of the altar shall face east. The idea here is that as you go up the steps to the altar, you climb the mountain. You're climbing back into Eden. That's what's happening. That you're climbing back into Eden, and you're going back to where God is and where all the fruitfulness and the blessing and the glory of God exists. You're going back into where He is. Now, it requires death, and it requires the fire consuming and all that stuff, but that's what happens. And that's why in Psalm chapter 26, if we look at verse 6 through 8, the psalmist's attitude toward going and worshiping God and going and making a sacrifice at the altar is not one that we would probably recognize. It says, I wash my hands in innocence and go around your altar, O Lord, proclaiming thanksgiving aloud and telling all of your wondrous deeds. O Lord, I love the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells. So the issue here is that the altar is a place of reconnecting with God. And so even if there's a cost associated with it, the cost is very pale in comparison with the reconnection with God, of being reunited with God. It happens at the altar. Now, the interesting thing is the altar, you could say that the altar is a place of, if the altar represents the highest place where you come as close to God as you possibly can, you could say, well, the highest principle then is sacrifice. And the problem is that that's true and that's false, because it is sacrifice, but the problem is that you can't make an adequate sacrifice. That's really kind of what all the Old Testament stuff is about, is that, yes, sacrifice is required, but you can't really make an adequate sacrifice. It's probably better to say that the highest place is the highest thing, is the highest point, the thing that's on the altar that brings us reconnection with God is not sacrifice per se, but Christ's sacrifice specifically. In the Old Testament, you would, if you were doing a whole burnt offering, you would take the animal and you would sacrifice the head and the front legs. You'd put those on the altar, and the best fatty portions of the insides of the animal, and you put all that on the altar and you'd burn it. And then the rear quarter, the rear part of the animal, you would wash that, and then that would go on the altar after. And the symbolism there is that it's Jesus' sacrifice that goes up to heaven, and then we get washed through baptism, and then we as the body go up to heaven. So the point is that it's not so much just like any old thing of sacrifice is how you get close to God. And so you could go through your life thinking, well, all I have to do is sacrifice something and I'll get close to God. And that was kind of the ancient mindset, is, I need to go to the temple, make a sacrifice, and then I can have a better outcome in my life, and then I'll get closer to God, and my life will become more organized and more fruitful and more blessed. And the problem is that's not exactly true, because you don't really know what to sacrifice, and you don't really know how to sacrifice, and you don't really have what it takes to sacrifice the right things. Only Jesus has done that, and so it's Christ's sacrifice that is what's at the highest point. Now, Christ's sacrifice is also for others, and so when the rest of the body gets washed and it gets sacrificed, it's also sacrificing for others as well. But it comes after Jesus' sacrifice, and that's an important thing for us to understand. It's not just sacrifice. It's Christ's sacrifice, and the church lives out Christ's sacrifice. So that's an important distinction to make, because we don't want to people to think that they can take this just as a principle and apply it to their life, and then they're good with God and everything's going to be great. That's not the way that it works. So these are important things for us to consider and understand as we look at altars, and we'll be going through a lot of these kinds of things as we go through this picture of how these Old Testament images work. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you guys next week.